In Units 5 and 6, we learned how to do tests and confidence intervals for one proportion. In other words, statistical questions about one variable where the variable was categorical. In Unit 7, we transferred that to quantitative data, so we're doing tests and confidence intervals for one mean. Now we're going to be doing sort of the same thing, except we're going to be comparing two groups. So this is the first time that we've got two variables for inference. Here our explanatory variable is going to be categorical, that's where we get the groups from, and the response variable is going to be quantitative. This is a study from the Journal of Applied Psychology where they wanted to see whether the content of TV shows would influence the ability of viewers to recall brand names of items featured in the commercials. So this was an experiment. Participants were randomly assigned to watch one of two programs. One of them had violent content and another had neutral content. And each one had the same 9 commercials. And then after the show ended, they were asked to try to remember as many brands as they could, and they would record the number that were recalled. So the outcome that we're interested in is how many brands the viewers could remember, right? So this is our response variable, and since we're recording how many they could remember, it would be a quantitative response. And then what we're using to predict is what kind of content they were watching. So it could have been violent or it could have been neutral. So that's going to be our explanatory variable, and that's categorical. Specifically, it's binary because we're just comparing two groups in this unit. So let's start by stating our hypotheses. So we have a quantitative response here, and when we have quantitative data, we would usually summarize that with mu. But here it's a little bit different because we have two groups that we want to compare. So the null hypothesis is that the mean number that they can remember when they're watching violent content is the same as the mean number that they remember when they're watching neutral content. And if we want this to look more like it did in the past, where we had like a parameter equal to a number, we can rearrange this a little bit and we can write it as a difference. So I'm going to write the mean for violent content minus the mean for neutral content is equal to 0. For the alternative, we have to decide if this is a one or a two-sided test. So here, we just want to know if the type of content influences their ability to recall brand names. So it doesn't say which group we expect to remember more. So we're going to use a not equal sign here. So we can write it as the mean for violent is equal to the mean for neutral, or again, we can write it as a difference. Mu v minus mu n is not equal to 0. So this is an experiment because they're being randomly assigned to groups and told which type of content to watch. So what is the purpose of this random assignment? So if you remember from Unit 2, we've got two different kinds of randomness. It could be random selection, where the purpose is to generalize to the population, or it could be random assignment, where the purpose is to support cause and effect conclusions. So how does that work? How does random assignment actually give you cause and effect conclusions? So the main problem that keeps us from talking about cause and effect is that we sometimes have groups that aren't really comparable. So like in this scenario, maybe you could imagine that viewers who watch violent content by their own choice are different than viewers who watch neutral content. Maybe the ones who watch violent content are younger, for example. And that would be a problem because age or other variables could affect how many brands people can remember. So we basically can't tell in that case, is it because of the content they were watching, or is it because of the type of person who chooses to watch that content has a tendency to pay attention or not pay attention to ads? So to prevent that problem, we're going to use random assignment to balance all of those factors out. So the way this actually works is that random assignment creates balanced, comparable groups. So let's just take age for now. If you think about age as being something that could be related to both the type of content and the number of brands people could remember, we want to balance out our groups in terms of age. So if you use random assignment, some older people are going to be in each group and some younger people are going to be in each group. And because the groups are balanced, it shouldn't be age then that's influencing how many brands they can remember because they're comparable in that way. It must be the content. That's the only difference between the two groups. So we're trying to prove the alternative. We're trying to show that violent and neutral content are different in terms of brand recall. So what are we looking for here? What would provide strong evidence that they actually are different? So three things I want you to think about. In terms of sample sizes, what sample sizes would help us get strong evidence, large or small? In terms of the means, are we expecting the means to be close together or far apart? And in terms of standard deviations, if we want strong evidence, do we want our standard deviations to be large or small? So pause the video here and think about what would provide strong evidence. So if we want to have strong evidence, in terms of the sample size, we want our sample sizes to be large, right? The larger our sample sizes, the more information we get, and the stronger our evidence tends to be. So there was pretty nice sample sizes in this study. There was 108 people in each group, so not too bad. For the means, if we're trying to prove that the means are actually different from each other, then we would want to see sample means that are far apart. The farther apart they are, the more evidence we have that the two means actually aren't equal to each other. And in this study for the violent content, the average number of brands was about 2.08. For the neutral content, it was a little bit higher, about 3.17 was the average. For standard deviation, it may not be quite so obvious whether you want it to be large or small. So let's compare these two data sets. So in the first one, the one on the left, there's a lot of overlap between group 1 and group 2. If we look at the second data set, the one on the right, notice that the means are the same as they were before, but the standard deviations are smaller. This one actually provides stronger evidence that the two means are different, even though the sample means are the same. Because if we look at the distributions, we have way less overlap here. So we also want to have small standard deviations. And the standard deviations here are 1.87 in the violent group and 1.77 in the neutral group. In this chapter, we're not going to focus very much on doing calculations by hand. We wanted to do that in units 5 through 7 just to kind of give you a sense of what those formulas were doing, so you would have some intuition for it. But in practice, you're always going to use JMP or some other kind of software to do that. So we're going to focus more on the interpretations in this unit. So here you can see the t-statistic, the degrees of freedom, and the p-value. The degrees of freedom, you'll notice, is a really ugly number. It's not just the sample size minus 1 anymore. There's actually a pretty terrible formula for it called the Saturn weight equation. I think that's how you pronounce it. So yeah, we're not going to do this by hand. We're going to let the computer take care of it. So let's start with the p-value interpretation. It's a little bit different than what you've seen in previous chapters, but you should be able to work it out. The same basic definition of a p-value applies. So pause the video here and see if you can pick out the correct interpretation. So choice A is the correct interpretation here. To think about why that's true, let's look at the three parts of a p-value interpretation. The p-value is the probability of getting our statistic or more extreme in the direction of the alternative, assuming that the null hypothesis is true. And all three of those parts are in this interpretation. So assuming that the null hypothesis is true, in this context, that means assuming that they're equal, that violent and neutral content really have the same effect on memory. And in that case, the p-value is the probability of getting our statistic, a difference of negative 1.09, or more extreme. And we're saying or more extreme because it's not equal in the alternative. So if there was really no difference, the chance of getting a difference like we saw in the sample or larger is basically 0. So that leads us back to questioning the null hypothesis because it would be so unlikely to produce data like ours. So let's fill this in here. If violent and neutral content really had the same effect on memory, so this is the null hypothesis. We're assuming that the null hypothesis is true. If violent and neutral content really had the same effect on memory, we would be very unlikely to get a sample difference like ours. So unlikely because a small p-value, remember the p-value is a probability, so this means that there's a very small probability of getting an outcome like ours. So now that we've interpreted this value as a probability, how would you state your conclusion in context? So this third choice is the correct conclusion. This study provides strong evidence And the way we know that the evidence is strong is based on the size of the p-value. A small p-value also gives us strong evidence. And we're going to conclude that the content of TV shows influences the ability to recall brand names. So this is the same as previous units in the sense that we're always trying to conclude the alternative. So let's think about how this statement matches up with our alternative hypothesis. If we say that the mean for violent and neutral content is not the same, that's what our alternative is, that's saying that it makes a difference, right? What type of content you see makes a difference. And so if we want to put that into words, we could say that it influences the ability to recall brand names. So before I give you the confidence interval for the difference in the means, go ahead and make a prediction here. Based on the p-value that you're given, is the confidence interval going to contain 0? So the answer is no, this confidence interval will not contain 0. So if you think about our p-value here, we had rejected the null hypothesis, right? The null hypothesis says that the difference in the means is equal to 0, but because our p-value was so small, we rejected that value. If we reject it, that means it's not a reasonable value, so it should not be in the confidence interval. So I'm just going to give you the confidence interval for now. I'm going to show you later how to calculate it. But the confidence interval is negative 1.578 up to negative 0.602. So not including 0 here. And we're going to interpret this interval in context. And we can say that we are 95% confident that the violent content is going to decrease the number of brands recalled. Violent content decreases the number of brands recalled. So we notice that we've got negative numbers in the interval. That's why it's decrease recalled by this amount. So by 0.602 to 1.578 on average. So we don't know exactly what the effect of the different content is, but we know that it's somewhere between a 0.6 and a 1.6 reduction, basically. So notice there's a connection between hypothesis tests and confidence intervals, but they're not giving you exactly the same thing. So if you think about what was the purpose of a hypothesis test, the purpose of a hypothesis test is just to ask, is there a difference? Right? Is there a difference between violent and neutral content in terms of the brands that people remember? Whereas the confidence interval is not just saying, is there a difference, although you can sort of use it that way. The main purpose of a confidence interval is to say, how big is the difference? So for practical reasons, it matters a lot, right? If you know that there's a difference, but it's only like 0.1 on average or something like that, then it probably doesn't really matter where you put your ads. People are basically just as likely to remember them. But if it makes a big difference, then you may not want to put your ads on violent content, or maybe at least you don't want to pay as much for those ads. So both the hypothesis test and the confidence interval are useful. So this scenario is pretty different than what we've done in previous units because we're looking at a relationship between the two variables. We've got two different groups to compare. But a lot of the main ideas, p-values, stating conclusions, interpreting confidence intervals, all of that is going to be the same as it was in previous units. So it really builds on the work that you've already done.